Episode 6. Dissident. Wednesday, July 15, 2037. 5 days before, Sam did not want to be there. A thick fog hung below the executive level of Proda HQ, blotting out his view of the city. The top of the pyramid punctured the marine layer, but the gray sky above offered no relief. He saw his reflection in the glass. He was the same color as the fog. Rook stood behind him, talking, but Sam wasn't listening. He would just take one. He was nursing a tumbler of water in one hand. His other hand was in his pocket, clutching a cold, hard little pill. The pills that Sam had stopped taking. The pills he was so happy to be free from. No, he let go of the pill, took his hand out of his pocket, and turned to Rook, tuning back into the conversation. 70 people caught driving illegally printed cars in the last day, Rook said. Huge increase in illegal solar use and all. We patched the vulnerability. This old backdoor admin panel with a password left over from God knows when. Hardly anyone knew it was still there. But they used our printers to print new printers without security software. We can't brick those from here. Now people are copying all sorts of stuff. The cat's out the bag? Sam nodded. Rook was looking back at him, waiting for a reply. But Sam didn't feel much like sharing the overwhelming sense of dread he was feeling. Sam saw Rook as a blunt instrument, highly capable when it came to physical force and intimidation. He had made Sam feel better the other day, with his story about the tower block in London, but Rook was not someone Sam enjoyed spending a time with. But he was the right tool for this job. Of that, Sam had no doubt. The double doors opened as Jane walked in. Sam felt relieved, pleased to see someone else, even if it was her. She looked tense. She stared daggers at Rook for a second, before turning to Sam. You asked to see me, she said curtly. Jane, thanks for coming. Listen, are you sure these kids were responsible for the hack? He asked. No, that's why I said we should. Sam watched as she caught herself. She cracked a slight, tight smile. I'm not 100% sure, no. Why? What's going on? Sam sat on the corner of the boardroom table, not in love with her tone. The hack has been modified, he said. People are using it to print printers we can't patch, that will copy anything illegally. With no way for us to stop them. It doesn't look like the work of kids. Jane looked surprised. What kind of things are they printing? Sam stood and paced back towards the windows. Cars. Solar windows, batteries. Vitrovats. God knows what else, he said, turning to look at her. Now do you understand why we had to go in the way we did? Sam heard himself. He sounded defensive. He knew the raids had upset her and a lot of people that worked for him. A few had quit. No one important. Nov Devet and the rest of the board were standing by him. But some of his friends had expressed disapproval. Last night while having dinner at the Bohemian Club, he'd gotten a few funny looks. That bothered him, but Rook was right. Better to show force now and nip this in the bud. Jane was biting her lip. Then she said it anyway. But it didn't help, did it? Sam blinked, shocked at her candor. His silence didn't stop her. It didn't do any good killing that kid Carlos, or banning Broadside. It just made people angry. And now this hack has spread anyway and… Sam raised his hands calmly, smiling at Jane. We're not the bad guys here, Jane. My heart breaks for Carlos and his family, wherever they are. But what these hackers did could destroy the company, potentially the entire economy. Our response was appropriate given what was at stake. I know it's not easy but… Not easy? Sam, it was murd. Oh, give it a rest, love. Rook cut her off. We don't need a lecture from you on. Why, what do you propose? Jane turning and glaring at Rook. Her face was hot. We just send you in to kill everyone who copies something? Rook stepped forward, squaring up to Jane. I'll do what I have to do to protect Proda's interests, he hissed, which I should remind you, are your interests, Miss Stratton. They stared each other down. Sam sighed, stepping forward, pleading for calm. He had little patience for executives unable to regulate their emotions in his presence, but he needed to diffuse this. Guys, please, I need you both on my side. Jane ignored him. I'm not scared of you, she snarled at Rook. So you say, Rook smiled, but your eyes betray you. He leaned right into Jane's face. She winced, covering her mouth. Your breath betrays you, she replied. Rook stepped back, embarrassed. Jane shot Sam a look as she stormed out. Sam turned back to the view and sighed, frustrated as he looked back into the foggy abyss. He reached into his pocket, took out the pill and swallowed it, chasing it with water. Michelle wasn't listening to the speaker. She sat at the 4 p.m. VRA meeting in the dead mall basement, in a ring of chairs with the usual suspects. The room was dingy, resplendent in shades of beige and brown. She often came here before heading to the cranes, but she wasn't working today, or for at least the next week, she'd told her boss. Her arm was never going to be the same. But neither was anything else. They would come looking for her soon enough, she knew that. The question was, what's she supposed to do now? Michelle looked down at her mangled limb. Under her clothes, she could feel the synthetic tissue holding the throbbing lacerations across her shoulder together. The new layers of synthetic skin were held in place with staples and stitches, swaddled in gauze, peeking out from under her shirt. The color was wrong. It was lighter than her natural skin. She felt like a car with a different colored door. The skin was sunburnt and blistering in one place too. Danusha had said that might happen. The pigment took a minute to come in. The skin felt cold and alien against her real flesh. The sunburn crackled and stung as she shifted in her chair. Danusha had assured her the new arm would come to feel like part of her, in time. That it would be much stronger than before. Right now, it felt like she had a dead octopus stuffed with fiberglass stapled to her shoulder. Michelle was mad. Mad at her arm, mad at the marshals, Proda, her brother, at Danusha's backstreet operation. But she knew better than this. Negative thinking wouldn't get her anywhere good. She should be grateful she was still alive. But she wasn't. Michelle breathed out, trying to let go of her resentments. She looked out at the familiar circle of faces in the room as she listened to the speaker. Camilla sat opposite with a new guy who looked shell-shocked and broken, the way all newcomers did. He was thin and pinched, in his late 40s, kind of pathetic looking. His skin was swarthy, but sickly white, like he was ill. It seemed like he'd been sleeping outside. Michelle knew what he was going through. She'd felt as bad as he looked when she came in too. That's all the time we have. The meeting's secretary began. The circle stirred as the meeting ended. Michelle got up to leave, not wanting to make small talk. Camilla tapped her good shoulder as she headed for the door. Hey! Michelle turned. The new guy was next to Camilla. How's your arm, honey? Michelle shrugged her good shoulder, nursing her bad one. Camilla nodded. I still can't believe it. I thought all this was behind us after the massacre in 29. Her voice got small as it trailed off. She caught herself. Anyway, Michelle, I want you to meet Art. It's his first meeting. Art offered a hand. Michelle shook it with her good one. Art's grip was limp and cold. Art needs a sponsor. I thought maybe you guys should talk. Michelle felt her chest tighten with reservation. Yeah, Michelle said, meaning never in a million years. She feigned regret, shaking her head and motioning to her shoulder. It's just that right now, what with everything. She stopped talking as a chat message from Camilla appeared in the corner of her eye. Right now you need to be of service, mommy. Michelle blinked away the words. Camilla was right. The best way for addicts to deal with their problems was to help someone else with theirs. There's a reason we're both here today, smiley face. Michelle sighed. She didn't completely buy all Camilla's cosmic coincidence stuff, especially when delivered with emojis. But she had stayed sober by listening to her, even when she didn't want to. Oh, yeah, sure. She relented. I guess I can help. Got time for a coffee? Art nodded, thanking her. Michelle held out her hand again. Art shook it a little harder this time. Michelle and Art posted up at the small, down-at-heel coffee shop across the street from the dead mall, where VRA members often gathered. Camilla was sat in a booth nearby with a group of old-timers. Michelle had sponsored people in VRA before. It was pretty straightforward. You helped them define the stuff they wanted to stay away from. going deep in the metaverse or whatever digital addiction they were struggling with. Then you checked in with them and made sure they were sticking to their plan and coached them through the 12 steps. Working the steps was how Michelle got clean. Helping others do the same was how she stayed that way. Michelle listened as Art told his story. It was a sad one, same as everyone else's. He didn't elaborate much. In fact, he avoided details, bursting into tears when he got to certain parts. This didn't faze Michelle. She had been where he was, she understood the rawness of it all, the shame and the guilt he was feeling. All Art would tell her was that something bad happened while he was going deep in a metaverse den downtown. There had been repercussions and he had to go on the run, leaving his family behind. But there was clearly more to it. Art looked like he'd stared death in the face. It was fine. Michelle didn't need to hear it all right now. She would get through the rest of his story with him in detail as they worked the steps. It was clear Art was broken enough to be serious about getting clean. That was enough for her. The more she listened, the more she forgot her own troubles. She found herself relaxing a little, despite the pain. Camilla was right. Helping him was helping her. They got up to leave. Michelle knew of an empty storage unit by her place in the towers where Art could crash for a while. This wasn't part of her responsibility as Art's sponsor. But something had gone horribly wrong in this guy's life, and as Michelle listened, she felt compelled to keep him out of harm's way. Maybe this was the sense of purpose she'd been looking for. Art started sobbing again, thanking her profusely. They walked out of the cafe. Camilla walked over again as they left, pulling Michelle to one side. "Hey, I almost forgot. You should come back over here to the Dead Mall tomorrow evening," Camilla whispered, looking shifty. "An old friend of mine is organizing some people, a direct action group, you might call it. Bring your brother. A lot of Broadsiders are coming. A lot of old faces from the protest days too. Folks are angry about what the marshals did to you kids." Camilla handed Michelle a small silver square, an NFT tag. On it was a picture of a hand with an eye in the middle. Michelle opened it using Luminous. Inside were files containing what looked like armor and weapon designs for Broadside game, links to an encrypted torrent, an encrypted chat app called Sent, a strange-looking README file, some currency she'd never heard of called dollar bones, and an NFT book called Rotten to the Core. "Is this a raw thing?" Michelle asked, puzzled. "No," Camilla replied. "This is something else." It was early evening by the time the fog outside had cleared, and the boardroom was Sam's once more. The pills had kicked in. It felt like he was sitting with an old friend. It had been too long. His therapist wouldn't be happy, but he needed this today. This hack was spreading, undermining all he had built. So far it was mostly concentrated in the Bay Area, but Washington and the rest of the country was watching. If Proda didn't contain this, they would lose their grip, and at that point, whether a CRA was signed would be moot. Code is law. Sam had been in tech long enough to understand that. He needed to be in control of his emotions to get through this, so pills it was. He leaned back in his chair, looking out at the city like he was waiting for a ship to come in. The sky was a study in orange and blue, underscored by the uneven silhouette of rolling hills known as Twin Peaks. Downtown San Francisco glowed, the bay glinting behind it. White and red lights flowed through the city's arteries. Behind it all, the Sutro Tower loomed from the hilltops. The tower was still one of the most distinctive parts of the skyline, even though it was built in the 1970s. The imposing steel structure was painted red and white like a candy cane. Red lights blinked from its head, warning passing aircraft. It stood on 3 tall legs that formed an hourglass-shaped frame. It reached almost 1,000 feet into the air, its 3-horned crown of antenna jutting into the sky. Once it was used to transmit FM radio. Now it carried digital signals, delivering channels, streams, and data across the Bay Area. San Franciscans had always been divided over the structure. Some saw a postmodern thing of beauty. Others saw a monster that looked like it might storm down the hill and destroy the Golden Gate Bridge. Sam liked this analogy, but not because he saw a monster. To him, the tower was a god. He had redesigned the marshals with the tower in mind when he took over Proda. Their wiry metal frames painted red and white, their glowing eyes watching the city. Power, security, freedom. This is what he offered. This is what his technology ecosystem, his robot army, and this towering steel giant before him stood for. He flipped on the news. Proda advised people to stay vigilant, but carry on as normal despite the security breach, announced the anchor. Expect more marshals on the streets, longer lines at checkpoints and heavier air surveillance. Sam looked out at the tower again. He saw what he was waiting for come into view. A huge, hunchbacked hexacopter rose over the tower like a vulture. It was painted the same red and white as the marshals and the tower below it, held in the air by 8 huge rotor blades. Its wide, flat body looked like a manta ray. The ship cloaked, vanishing into the sunset. Sam smiled. He could fix this. On the other side of the hills, deep in the streets of South City, a crowd pulsated at a block party. Aside from the bloodshed and violence at the raided Broadside games, the hack had brought nothing but happiness this side of town. An old optimism had resurfaced. Music pumped from speaker stacks lining the street. Vitro vats bubbled on food carts, spitting out all manner of sizzling street delicacies. Stalls printed solar panels, vats and other basics. Hacked Broadside weapons and armor, both physical and NFT versions, were being sold everywhere. The air was thick with all kinds of sweet-smelling smoke. 3D bass lines sent tremors underfoot as the crowd moved in unison to a skittering, tribal beat. Riz and Paprika bobbed and weaved through the crowd, towards the place Zero had told them to meet. Freshly printed D-tag hoodies shrouded their faces, and more importantly, their data. They darted past the printer stalls and sound systems. Paprika looked up at a newscast streaming on a big screen above, patching the anchor's voice in over the din of the sound systems. Proda is warning anyone suspected of using the hack that they could find their food and power supplies cut off. Riz listened too, looking back at the party. She shook her head with a laugh. Up ahead of them, a DJ in a green ski mask spun floating, flickering discs in the air in front of a wall of bass bins at a party being thrown by metaverse radio station Culture Cult. Mr. Dallas was there too, spitting into the mic. The air rippled and snarled as luminous waves of 3D bass music billowed through the crowd. A sadness washed over Paprika with the music. Mr. Dallas was Carlos' favorite MC. Without warning, a team of marshals burst from a side street, fanning out like ants. The crowd scattered. People began pelting the robots with food and trash. The marshals clapped back with heat. Paprika felt terror rising in their chest as the screaming started. The robots barged into the sound system, kicking in the bass bins, hauling away the DJ and Dallas as the party became a riot. Paprika, bellowed a familiar voice. Paprika turned to see a hulking, pixelated shadow, also in a D-tag hoodie and Broadside chest armor, crouched in an alleyway, beckoning. Paprika and Riz looked at each other, and at the robots circling, and ran towards the gap in the buildings. Paprika grabbed Riz and they hurried down the maze of alleyways, following the hooded figure until the sounds of the riot were muffled by the labyrinth of narrow, crooked 3D printed buildings around them. The figure stopped. Riz and Paprika slowed up too, catching their breath. "Thank you," said Paprika. "All part of the service, ma'am," the figure said, removing the hood. The pixels dissolved back into reality, revealing Shiv's grinning face. "That was too close," said Riz. "We should have taken the back way." Paprika noticed that Riz was still holding their hand. Riz noticed too, looking up at Paprika with a nervous smile before gently letting go. "Shiv said that too, but I was hungry," said another familiar voice, that sounded like it was chewing food. Paprika turned to see Taki up ahead in the shadows, also in a D-tag hoodie and Broadside bone suit, with a burrito in one hand, and a digital spray can in the other, which he was using to deface a Proda billboard floating above the alley. Instead of the familiar line, "Power, security, freedom," Taki had altered it to read, "Purgatory, slavery, fascism, bitch please, you always hungry," Shiv said, chiding their friend. Paprika smiled. The riot behind them sounded far away. They looked around the alley. On a wall close by, in old-fashioned spray paint, someone has scrawled, "Resistance is fertile." Above, skull and crossbones emojis were floating around in the sky like little stars. Another digital message demanded, "Sign a craw now." Paprika motioned to the graffiti. "This is out of control." Riz nodded, looking around. The hack's got people thinking. Seeing how life can be different. Zero was right. Shiv hiked an eyebrow at this. "I dunno," they said. "Making everything free sounds like straight-up chaos to me. Which I'm totally fine with, by the way." Shiv grinned and cracked their knuckles, motioning for the others to follow them. The four of them began walking in the opposite direction from the riot. Paprika respected Shiv's anarchic perspective, but suddenly felt compelled to communicate what Zero had said. "I don't think he means everything should be free," Paprika said. "Just some things. The basics." "Right," Tacky sniffed, flicking his shiny hair. "A bifurcated market." "Well, if it's I know you into it," said Shiv. Tacky smirked and gave Shiv a dig in the arm. Shiv laughed, shoving him back playfully. Tacky pointed to a scratched-up sticker of a cartoon figure wearing a black hoodie and pink glasses, stuck to the chest plate of Shiv's armor. "Paprika's talking about stuff that's CC0 no copyright, public domain. Like this sticker you got. This is right-click and save as guy by XCOPY, right?" "And what?" said Shiv, nodding. "How much you pay for it?" Tacky asked. "Nothing. I just printed it," said Shiv. "Right, because it's CC0, Tacky nodded, taking another bite of the burrito. "But the original NFT of right-click and save as guy is hanging in the Louvre and worth like a bajillion dollars. It's worth money because everybody knows it. Because everyone can share it. The more people share free copies, the more the original is worth." Shiv took this in. "Okay, word, but what about your armor?" replied Shiv. "What about it?" answered Tacky, still talking with his mouth full. Shiv motioned to Tacky's chest plate. Its brand new, candied paint job gleamed like a fresh manicure, not a CC0 sticker or scratch in sight. "I know you hacked this one, but the design you wearing is the official AXXOV1 bone suit. I also know you got this original, unhacked bone suit in like 6 other colors, and you paid a lot for those. AXO, the Broadside League and Proda make a lot of money from selling these to kids like you, because AXXO and Proda own the full commercial rights to it." Shiv poked at Tacky's armor, shoving him sideways, laughing. Tacky stumbled, laughing too, hitting the side of a printer recycle bin filled with plastics, knocking several items into the alley in front of them. "You can do both. It's like bottled water," said Paprika, motioning to a plastic bottle as it rolled to stop just ahead. Shiv, Tacky and Riz all looked at Paprika, puzzled. "You can have it either way and it still works, CC0 or commercial rights. Anyone can get free water, out the faucet, right?" Paprika continued. "But we also have name brand, bottled water and people buy lots of it. People pay for premium water, even though you can get free water whenever and wherever you want." Paprika was surprised to hear herself explaining Zero's point of view like this. They hadn't realized they had thought about it this deeply, much less agreed with it, or at least, cared enough to articulate it to someone else. "Okay, got it," Shiv nodded. "So, with the Accra protocol stuff, it's like they asking for government cheese. We'll have government cheese solar energy, government cheese versions of lots of stuff. But then you'll also be able to buy like, mac and cheese level solar energy, Gruyere level solar, etc." "Sort of," said Tacky, finishing the burrito. "Except the government wouldn't centrally control all this stuff like they do with government cheese. All they gotta do is ratify Accra. It's about giving us access to basic reusable printer materials, a set of CC0 designs for basic goods that are free to use, and then getting out of everyone's way." Paprika hadn't seen this more intellectual side of Tacky before. Shiv seemed like they understood. They looked at Paprika. "Well, whatever happens, this was all you, Paprika," Shiv said. "I mean, you straight up mushroom stamped Proto with this hack. You should be mad proud of that. Paprika stifled a smile. The grief was ever present, but Shiv's comment made their hearts swell with pride. A feeling Paprika instantly felt guilty about. This had cost Carlos his life. Tacky studied Paprika, flicking the burrito wrapper into a trash can and pulling his long hair back into a ponytail. You do see that, right? He said. What you did will change things. Paprika took this in as the group walked on, out of the alley and onto a busy street, pulling their hoods up as they emerged. The one good thing to come from this was Paprika had done something they thought was impossible. Changed things. More than that, people Paprika looked up to, some of the best Broadside players in the league, knew it was Paprika that did it, or at least, they knew Warhead had done it, even if no one knew exactly who Warhead was outside of their immediate circle. It felt good to have Shiv and Tacky treating them as a peer. It felt good to call them friends. But it also felt awful, given how Paprika got to this point. Paprika felt their emotions come into focus, as the conflicting feelings of gratitude and grief swirled together into a cloud of anger. Maybe, but I'm here for Carlos. I'm doing this for him. The others nodded, silently, respecting this. The group ducked through a doorway, down a flight of stairs opening into a basement-level parking garage at the back of the dead mall. They approached a crowd gathered on one side of the garage. Jason spotted them and nodded. They walked over to him. Paprika noticed a lot of people wearing D-tag hoodies, Broadside face grills, and many others in bone suits. It was not unusual to see Broadsiders wearing pieces of gear off the field. But since the raids, people who didn't play had been doing it too, as a show of solidarity. Paprika recognized Broadsiders from all over the bay, but kept their hood up, not wanting any attention right now. Paprika was tired of people telling them how sorry they were about Carlos, like they could do something about it. There were others in the garage who were clearly not Broadsiders. Some were Zero's age and wore the hand and eye t-shirt, the mark of the invisible hand. Paprika looked around at the crowd. A Hispanic woman in her 50s stood next to a young black woman dressed like a construction worker with her arm in a sling. Next to her was another kid who looked like he was related to the construction worker but was wearing a Broadside grill and chest plate. It felt like the whole city was here. A fold-up table stood in the middle of the crowd. A modified 3D one sat on top of it, surrounded by bits of equipment. A stack of speakers was behind it, much like the stack behind the DJ at the street party. Next to the table was a lifeless, off-lined Marshall, hanging like a puppet from a chain bolted to the ceiling. The crowd simmered as a figure in a hoodie stepped out, face down, dreads swaying. Zero removed the hood and looked around at his audience. Paprika looked at him. Something had changed. He was standing straighter. He was clean-shaven and in a clean shirt. He looked reinvigorated, younger almost. He cleared his throat. New technologies cause revolutions, Zero began. The printing press took down religion. The internet killed the printing press. But what came next? The combination of blockchain, cheap solar, in vitro and reusable 3D printed materials, all metaverse connected? That changed everything. He hit a button on the 3D one. It whirred as it woke up, starting to print something. Or at least, it did everywhere else, Zero continued. Proda denied America its revolution with the massacre in I-29. But the Broadside hack means revolution is finally at hand. Which is why they started killing us again. They're scared. They know we don't have to depend on them anymore. They know we can fight back. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Zero turned and opened a map of downtown San Francisco in the air. He zoomed in on the checkpoint at the top of Market Street. We're going to hit Proda back where it hurts, he said. Show Core he's no longer in control. But this isn't a game. We need real weapons. Real equipment. All the things we couldn't print before. The first thing you need, if you don't have one already, is one of these. He pulled his hood up. His face became a blur of pixels. This is a D-tag hoodie. Print one out. Wear it at all times. Just don't get caught, these things are very illegal. It will block all data, both in and out while the hood is up. No one will be able to scan you. It'll keep the drones off your scent too. He took off the hoodie and his face reappeared, as he walked over to the speaker stack. LRADs are sonic weapons. Feds have been using them for years to disperse human crowds with high-pitched sounds, but we discovered that low-end frequencies mess with the robots. So, we retrofitted speakers with LRAD tech designed to jam up a Marshall's operating system. Zero opened a music app and selected a track. He looked past it and smirked at Paprika. What do you kids call it now? 3D bass? That stuff works great. He stopped smiling. If you're not wearing a helmet, please cover your ears now. Zero threw on a 3D bass track. A vortex of bass rippled outwards from the speaker, shaking rib cages. Paprika felt every hair on their head vibrating, even though their helmets ear protectors. The crowd covered their ears or threw their helmets on. The Marshall's eyes flickered erratically, as it shuddered and swayed, bumping against the visible pulse of 3D bass. Zero lowered the volume but left the music on in the background as he picked up a broadside gauntlet from a combat-grade bone suit lying on the table. Paprika noticed it was thicker than the modded stuff they had made. It had the same colorway as their armor files they'd shared with Zero, only now the bright colors were dark and murky, like someone had mixed in black paint. There were spikes on the animal skull helmet now. Short spikes on the knuckles, shoulders, and elbows of the armor too. The gauntlets tightened around Zero's arm with a low squeal. He walked over to the Marshal. These new bone suits are thicker, Zero said over the music. Not quite military grade, but they'll take a few heat blasts. I also took the liberty of adding spikes to the knuckles, helmet, and elbows. Why, you ask? Spack! In one movement he twisted his leg, hip, and shoulder behind the weight of his fist. He threw a left hook into the body of the robot with power and precision, puncturing its ribcage. Green liquid gushed from the wound, spattering the floor. The room made a sound like it was surprised. Marshall's run on hydraulics, fluids, he explained. Hit them between the armor plates. Sever a main line and you'll take one down. He turned around with his back to the crowd. Paprika's heart filled for the second time that evening, when they saw Zero had kept 2 words stenciled on the back of his armor design. Skeleton crew. He picked up what looked like a handgun from the table. He turned to the crowd and sighed, thinking, choosing his words carefully. I know a lot of you are angry. A lot of you want blood, he said. Paprika felt like he was looking straight at them. Too many of my friends have been killed by Proto, by their so-called non-lethal weapons. Well, we won't be using them. Ads rays can kill. We will win this without damaging any living thing. We will not hurt anyone. We are freedom fighters, not terrorists. The crowd exchanged glances and a few disapproving boos, confused by the pacifist holding the gun. We will not fire a single bullet, he proclaimed, aiming the handgun at the Marshal. He pulled the trigger. Bam! A kernel of blue light exploded from the gun and slammed into the Marshal's head. Green goo erupted from its temple. The dead robot swayed with the impact. The booing turned to cheering. Instead, we will use these, he said, holding up the smoking gun. EMP blasters. They fire an electromagnetic pulse at an impact pressure high enough to puncture the hydraulics, but not enough to break bones. Zero paced as he spoke, looking as many people in the eye as he could. Do not fire these at other people. They won't kill, but they will hurt. He returned to the table, picking up a shotgun. This works on the same principle, but is better at close range, he said as he walked back to the Marshal, flicking his dreadlocks out of his face. Boom! The EMP shotgun fired a thick burst of blue light. It ripped a hole in the robot's lifeless torso. Green goo flecked the crowd, who moved back, shouting, shocked and excited by the blast. Ping! Zero turned to look at the 3D one, which had completed its job. It spat out a blue and silver orb. He leaned over and picked it up. Finally, we have good old EMP grenades. These can brick the operating system of an entire Marshal squadron if you time it just right. He squeezed the grenade. It charged up. He hurled it and FWOOOOOM. A ball of blue light sent the Marshal flying, a handful of Broadside players too. The music cut out as the speaker stack shorted out and toppled over. The players got up, dazed, but unharmed. Sparks danced as the dead robot's jittering body convulsed. People cheered. The room was abuzz. "Print what you need," Zero shouted over the hum of the crowd. Paprika felt a sense of excitement make its way over the sadness. They wished Carlos was there. It was because of Paprika that the city was armed and ready to fight back. It was because of them that Zero and his organization finally felt they could change things. Carlos would be proud. It was because of the hack, and because of the rage and sadness, that Paprika felt, for the first time in their life, that they could be about to do something important. Taking down Proto wouldn't just mean getting revenge. It would also be a way to honor Carlos. To change people's lives. To give Carlos a legacy. To make all the sadness mean something. Replace your old Broadside gear with the new combat-grade bone suits, Zero continued. They will protect you from both ADS rays and EMP blasts. Two figures with bandaged heads began handing out NFT tags with the invisible hand logo to people in the crowd. All the weapons and armor design files are available on IPFS via the tags we are handing out. Zero continued. Use the hack. Start distributing this stuff to those who want to join us. Start stockpiling. He turned, and then turned back, remembering something. Oh, and please don't use any existing wallets or currencies in connection with any of this. Set up a clean wallet. We've included a new form of currency they can't track known as dollar bones on the tags. If you need to trade with each other for any reason, please do everything using dollar bones. Paprika took a tag from a bandaged figure and opened the dollar bones wallet. A gold coin with a skull and crossbones logo appeared, spinning slowly, eyes glowing in the air. Be ready, Zero continued. Get your people ready. We will be in touch. Whether you played Broadside since you could walk or never played at all, this is no longer a game. Zero took a breath, looking left to right, wielding the silence like a club. We are all Broadsiders now, he bellowed. The crowd roared. Paprika roared with them. The Broadsiders filed out of the underground garage into the night. Members of the Invisible Hand stood at the door, handing out NFT tags with dollar bones and design files on them. Paprika and their friends were last out. Zero walked in front of Paprika, talking to Jason. It's no problem. I can handle it, Jason said to Zero. Handle what? Paprika interjected, catching up with them. Zero slowed his pace to walk with Paprika. Jason raised an eyebrow at Paprika and walked on ahead. Jason's setting up a comm center for us, Zero explained. There are hundreds in on this now. We need a secure way to talk. Jason looked back, smiling like the cat that got the cream. Paprika felt irritated. Why was Jason setting up the comm center? Paprika was the mastermind behind the hack, after all. They caught themselves. Paprika knew the grief was bringing out all the worst parts of their character. They read an article on grief saying this would happen. Fear of being left out or passed over was real for Paprika. It had been their entire life. They took a breath, trying to let this go. Zero narrowed his eyes at Paprika, smiling, understanding something. Don't worry. I have another job for you. Episode 7. Pirate. Thursday, July 16, 2037. 4 days before, Paprika skulked inside a bus shelter, hood up and data shrouded, watching morning commuters pass by. They were in the Hayes Valley section of the city. They wished Zero hadn't wanted to meet here. Opposite, towering high into the sky, was an urban farm. Crops and plants swayed on each level of the glass tower as it oscillated, basking in the morning sun. The floors of the building rotated in different directions, making sure all the crops got sunlight. Under the irrigation system and hydroponic lighting on each floor, all manner of things grew. An unmanned harvester crawled through a field of corn on one floor. Families picked strawberries for fun on another. Paprika eyed a construction crane opposite the farm, pointing its nozzle at a steel structure. It squirted flash-heated ceramic and sandstone chips onto the steel, forming a wall high above the street. It was a painful place to be. Paprika and Carlos used to hang out at the park close by on Octavia Street, by the burger place, Carlos's favorite in the whole city. An icon and Luminous let less than Paprika's greater than know they had an old video pinned to the wall by the burger place. Paprika opened it. The video from Paprika's POV showed Carlos, Riz and some other kids building a fly-off ramp by the wall of the burger joint. Paprika smiled, remembering. They were using this cheap portable printer Riz found, laughing, trying not to get hot ceramic on themselves. They had no idea what they were doing, shakily printing the ramp it right up against the wall, spraying the hot ceramic straight onto the brickwork. Paprika remembered how much fun it was as they watched, skateboarding up the ramp, trying to wall ride, falling and laughing their heads off, until the manager of the burger joint chased them off, smashing the flimsy ceramic ramp to pieces, shouting after them as they ran and laughed harder. The video stopped and disappeared. The faded ceramic outline of the ramp clung to the wall, moss and graffiti growing over it. A brilliant sadness shot through Paprika. This happened several times a day. Every corner of the city harbored a memory of Carlos, and every one of them hurt as much to relive as the last. Paprika tried contacting their dad again through Sent, the only app they felt safe using. Still nothing. He seemed to have disconnected too. Suddenly Sent jammed and crashed. A pickup loaded with scaffolding poles rattled to a stop in front of Paprika. Zero was driving, dressed like a construction worker, pointing a signal jammer at Paprika. "I told you, stop using Luminous," Zero ordered. "Even Sent isn't safe at this point." Paprika nodded, rolling their eyes as they climbed in. Giving up Luminous had been harder than they thought. Maybe the metaverse was addictive after all. Zero looked like less of a slob today, Paprika noticed. Buffer maybe? The shuffling drums and chopped vocals of a Brazilian funk song pumped from the speakers. Paprika leaned forward and switched over to Culture Cult. 3D bass filled the truck. Zero raised an eyebrow at Paprika. He paused, listening for a second, before nodding along with approval to the music. He smirked at Paprika, who smiled back and looked out of the window. They drove in silence. Paprika noticed an EMP blaster on the floor, peeking out from under Zero's seat. "Where'd you learn about fighting and weapons and all that stuff?" Paprika asked. Zero thought on this for a beat. He turned the music down. "After the massacre, things got bad. We had to fight just to survive." Paprika nodded. They had a lot more respect for Zero since the demo at the Dead Mall. They looked out of the back into the flatbed of the truck. "So, is this how we're gonna fight him? A truck full of poles?" Zero smiled, watching the road. "Combat is all about dissimulation," he replied. "Not letting the other guys see you." He pointed up at something. Paprika looked out. High in the sky and barely noticeable, a transparent blur hovered above Twin Peaks. Something was there, cloaked, waiting. "See that? It's a surveillance ship," he said. "Proda is using it to track digital communication in the city. All of it, even Sent, in real time, which is totally unconstitutional. Not that anyone cares anymore. Anyhow, we can't coordinate with thousands of people over a digital network without them noticing. So, we need a network that's not digital." The kitchen at Michelle and Koth's place looked like a bomb factory. Stained sunlight streamed in through grimy windows. The bay and SFO airport were visible in the distance through the gaps between the towers. An old-looking 3D1 printer was running hot, printing plates of armor. EMP guns sat ready on the table. Spools of filament and printer materials surrounded them. Michelle smiled as they worked. She couldn't remember the last time her and Koth had done something together like this. "You know what I heard?" Koth said. He was there. "At the meet." "Who?" "Warhead, the leader of this thing. The guy they're looking for." "Isn't that Zero guy?" "Nah, he's just one of the guys is what I heard. But Warhead is, like, the guy." The speech at the Dead Mall had left an impression on them both. Michelle hadn't felt like this. Ever. Like she could do something to impact things around her, to change how life could be. The last piece of armor plating was ready. Michelle pulled it out of the chamber as Koth loaded a new schematic. The plan for the next item appeared in the air. "Jesus!" cried Michelle. "That's a rocket launcher, Koth." Relax. It's an EMP launcher, Koth retorted. They told us to print it, so I guess we're gonna need it. They had volunteered to defend an area by the freeway when the time came. So far all they had received were instructions about what to print. It worried Michelle that they didn't know where these instructions were coming from exactly. Then again, they weren't supposed to. Everything was decentralized and anonymous. Being a rebel was kind of like being in VRA. The EMP launcher was coming together. Koth looked out of the window, across the walkway towards the opposite side of the tower. How's your man doing over there? He asked Michelle. Okay, I guess, Michelle shrugged. He's in bad shape. He completely shut down his OS, so he's not tempted to look at anything. You know. Koth raised an eyebrow. You ain't worried about having this guy around? Like, at all? We don't know a thing about him. It's supposed to be anonymous. We're not supposed to. Yeah, I get it, said Koth. But you ain't supposed to bring your anonymous friends you just met back to live with you while they get clean either, is how I understand it, right? He isn't living with us. He's in the storage unit. Look, it's hard to explain, but I saw a way to help him out, so I did. He seems like a good guy. PSSSH, said Koth, tweaking the settings on the 3D one. We'll see. We will. Michelle looked at him. We'll also see if it was smart to print out a rocket launcher and attack some marshals, because we heard some old guy talking about freedom in a car park. Koth let out a laugh. Touché, he conceded. Michelle looked out at the storage unit. I'ma check on him, she said. Michelle walked down the walkway to the storage spaces. She gave her bandaged arm a squeeze. It was feeling better, like Danusha said it would. It felt stronger, but it wasn't quite part of her yet. Art was sat on the air mattress Michelle had lent him. He had the news streaming from a Freeview channel you could access without Luminous connected. He had another screen and keyboard open too. He was writing something. Michelle knocked on the open door. How you feeling, man? Art turned and gave a faint smile. Just finishing up these questions on my first step, from the workbook. Was gonna share them at the meeting later. Michelle nodded, looking at the rolling coverage of the printer hack and the Broadside raids on the news. Crazy times, huh? The same photo of Carlos every news channel had been using flashed across the screen, as it did many times a day. Art looked at it, his face contorting. Tears rolled down his cheeks and he doubled over in pain. Michelle looked at him, baffled by his reaction. Art? Are you? I'm okay, Art whimpered under the sobs. He looked at Michelle, holding up an open hand, waving her away. I just need a minute. Really, I'm okay. Please, I'll come past on my way down to the meeting. Michelle nodded slowly before turning back to her apartment. Michelle was still confused about what just happened when she walked back into the kitchen. Koth frowned. Is he okay? Not really. Koth had another bubble open in the air. All it contained was a display that read 92.7 FM. What is that? Michelle asked. Secret weapon, Koth grinned. It was in with the design files in the NFT. No one knows what it does yet. Zero told us to download it, leave it open and stay locked on this frequency. Michelle nodded. The bubble was making a faint sound. She walked over to it, listening to the soft, low crackle of dead air. Paprika and Zero peered through the undergrowth. Sutro Tower was not heavily guarded. It was too high up to see much foot traffic. Zero had told Paprika why on the way up. After the social unrest of the late 20s, Prota's security forces had been on high alert, everywhere, all the time. By the early 30s, after the massacre, Prota believed any serious threat of rebellion had been crushed. Panop surveillance covered most of the city in real time. Dog jets could shock drop marshals anywhere in San Francisco inside of 5 minutes. The 20s had been about taking control. Since Sam Corr had taken over Prota, the strategy now was to maintain control, but with a softer show of power. Marshal, human interaction was kept to a minimum. Most people only dealt with marshals once or twice a day at the checkpoints. Panops, dog jets and riot wagons took care of anything else. The remains of the police force did what it could about any non-copyright related crimes. After Carlos's death, security forces had concentrated their efforts downtown. Any place where Broadsiders had played the hacked game was being patrolled around the clock. But Sutro Tower was not such a place. Only 2 marshals stood guard at the front gate, with no robots on the other side. Which is why Paprika and Zero had been able to sneak through the woods at the back undetected. They stood, hoods up in a clearing close to the tower base. Paprika steadied a 30 featuring tall antenna made of scaffolding poles into position. Paprika couldn't tell if it was because they really had become a full-fledged radical, or because it numbed the grief and helped channel the rage, but for whatever reason, they were enjoying this. The antenna swayed as Paprika locked it in position. The scaffolding poles were held together with duct tape. The tape wasn't strong enough to keep the antenna straight, so it was curling over a little, like a wilting plant. A short loop of rope was taped to the top of the antenna. Tacked to the bottom of the pole was a black box about the size of a fist. A drone jammer lay on the ground at Paprika's feet. Zero unpacked a drone from his bag. He laid it flat on its back, attaching various tools to the base of the craft. One was a hook, another was a soldering iron. Lastly, he snapped in 2 cartridges, one full of red paint, and one full of solder. He narrowed his eyes, looking up at the antenna. "Hold it steady," he said, opening a control screen for the drone. Paprika pulled the antenna close, straightening it up as much as they could. Zero opened a local luminous connection to the drone. The drone came alive, rotors whirring as it lifted itself into the air. Zero guided it towards the antenna, bringing the drone in line with the duct-taped joints of the mast. The drone squirted a jet of white-hot solder flux onto the duct tape. It enveloped the joint in liquid metal, before moving up to the next joint. Paprika flinched as drops of hardening solder fell close to their feet. "Steady," Zero said, as he finished the last joint. The crooked antenna now had 3 silver knuckles. Smoke trailed from them as they glowed white-hot. "All right," he said, "we have about 30 seconds. Zero guided the drone up to the loop of rope on top of the antenna. The craft teetered as he coaxed the hook through the loop. Paprika held the antenna as still as possible. After a few failed attempts, the drone hooked the antenna and lifted it skyward. Paprika let go as it took off. The drone reeled its catch into the air, ascending towards the tower. The antenna swung in the breeze as the drone carried it, getting smaller as it got higher. As it did so, a speck high above the tower began to descend, getting larger, coming into focus. A Panop security drone. "Okay kid, you're up," said Zero. Paprika knelt, grabbed the drone jammer, and took aim. A radar screen appeared in front of them. As the Panop got close to Zero's drone, it came into range on Paprika's screen. They isolated the Panop signal and pulled the trigger. The Panop wobbled, and then struggled, before finally falling to earth. It dropped through the tree canopy, taking several branches with it as it smashed into the ground. Paprika balled up a fist in satisfaction and grinned. "Nice," barked Zero, without taking his eyes off the task at hand. His drone was now about 300 feet in the air. He took a breath, steering it towards the leg of Sutro Tower. The pole hit the tower with a soft clunk. The hot solder attached the antenna to the side of the tower. The drone struggled for a second, before it wiggled free and unhooked itself from the antenna. Paprika watched, powering down the drone jammer and strapping it to their back. The antenna slid a few inches. Zero held his breath. The solder cooled, and it stopped sliding. Zero breathed out. The antenna was stuck fast. A silver scar cemented in place on the otherwise pristine red section of the tower's thick leg. Paprika noticed a movement out of the corner of their eye. They glanced at the front of the compound. The marshals guarding the tower were heading their way. Paprika felt their chest tighten. "We have to go," Paprika said. Zero kept his eyes on his drone. He lowered it down in front of the antenna, sending a new command. The drone sprayed red paint over the antenna, and the scar was gone. 10 seconds, Paprika hissed, eyes on the approaching robots. Paprika pulled out an EMP blaster, crouching and aiming in the marshal's direction through the bushes. Paprika watched, panic rising as Zero's drone finished the paint job. Zero pulled the drone back towards him, maneuvering it over the trees, and yanked it back down. He jumped out of the way as it hit the ground. 5 seconds. Paprika said. The marshals were almost upon them. Zero stuffed the drone into the backpack. Paprika broke into a run. Zero followed, diving after Paprika into the undergrowth. One of the marshals leapt forward as the two shadows disappeared into the thicket. It watched the bushes whip this way and that as something moved through them. It raised its weapon. "Over here!" shouted the second marshal. The first marshal turned. "Must have run out of juice," it said, holding up a broken wing from the downed pan up. "Anything over there?" The first marshal turned back and scanned the undergrowth. No IDs. No data signatures. No visual. No thermal. Negative. Just animals. The robots carried Panop's body back towards the main gate. High above them, the paint and solder on the now invisible antenna dried in the afternoon sun. "I don't get what we just did," Paprika said as they hiked down the hill, out of the woods. "Now there's a pole stuck on the Sutro Tower. So what?" Zero stopped to get his breath, looking out at downtown San Francisco sprawling below them. He turned and looked at the crooked fingers of the slums of South City in the distance, peeking over the hills in Bernal Heights. Then back at Sutro Tower behind them, shielding his eyes from the sun. He opened several screens. "It's called pirate radio," he explained. "It's how we listened to music when I was a kid. Back in Rio. This type of signal is way too primitive for them to even think to look for now. They only look for digital stuff. All you need is a safe place to set up a studio." As he spoke, Jason and Riz appeared on one of the screens at the safe house above the dead mall in South City. They were configuring freshly printed audio equipment of some kind. Zero zoomed in on a wire leading from the desk behind them at the safe house out through a crack in the window. From there you connect to an infrared horn which links to. He flipped to the next screen, which showed a horn-shaped device taped to the top of the towering slum. It was pointing at Sutro Tower in the distance. "Dud, our antenna here. Studio and transmitter are never directly connected. It's all done with infrared, so they can't trace your location. It's beautiful. DJs have been outrunning the authorities with this same setup, all over the world, since the 1950s, he chuckled. "Okay, word. So, I get that we used to listen to music using radio waves, but no one listens to actual radios anymore?" Paprika said. "The RFID chips we have these days have the power, memory and range to act as tiny little radios." Zero replied. "We have billions of those embedded in everything. The metaverse is built on them. We can use every chip in the city. We can broadcast to many, or talk one-to-one, and they'll never hear us. No one is even listening out for analog signals transmitted by humans anymore." He paused, smiling. "Okay, let's give it all a minute to warm up." They sat down on the ground and looked out at the city. After a minute, Paprika turned to him. "How come you put Jason in charge of the comms center? People think he's like the leader of all this now." Zero looked at Paprika, raising an eyebrow. "Does that bother you?" Paprika shrugged. Zero nodded. "Comms is an office job," he said. "Jason's bossy. He can make the trains run on time. But he's not a boss." Paprika narrowed their eyes. Zero returned the stare. "You've been trying to act tough all your life," he said. "But you're different. You're smarter than that. Not just 'cause you can hack printers or modify games. I think you can see the bigger picture, Paprika. I think those are the kind of leaders we need." Paprika was taken aback, not used to praise. Zero studied them. "Your parents teach you to think like that?" Paprika shrugged. "Mom was a bit like you, I guess, big picture. Went to protests and stuff. It broke Dad when she left. She just didn't come home one day. He never really talked about why. After a while we stopped asking." Zero nodded empathetically. "Dad's sort of the opposite. Small picture. Worked on security systems. Best sysadmin in the business, he used to say. Real focused. At least, he was. But I don't think either of them were what you would call leaders." Zero stood up. "Well, I think you could be Paprika. A real leader doesn't have to be the center of everything. A real leader empowers others to lead, he said. Leaders and centers with too much power corrupt. That's what we're fighting. We're trying to decentralize control. To decentralize everything. That's what all of this is about. Paprika felt the cynicism about all this creeping back. Talking about mom and dad was hard. They didn't like that Zero changed the subject back to his own cause so quickly. Mom used to do that. It was easier for some people to talk about lofty ideas and plans than feelings. Paprika realized that they still didn't trust Zero completely. Paprika stared blankly at him, making it clear they were not sold on all this. Zero nodded, understanding. He saw a spider clambering along. He leant down and put out his hand out. It crawled into his palm. You see this spider? If I crush its head, its center, it dies. He put it back down and it scuttled on. He leaned down and drew a star in the dirt with his finger. Now a starfish is different. A starfish has no center. You can crush most of it. He wiped away all but one leg of the starfish. Then started redrawing the rest of the starfish back in. But it can regenerate itself from a single leg. This movement we're building is a starfish. Proda is a spider. Do you understand? Paprika nodded, understanding. Then after a pause, shook their head. Nah, Paprika said, that ain't it. We're still a spider. Proda could shut off everyone's power. They could brick the whole city. Zero sat back up, shaking his head. He spread his hands out over the city. Soon we'll have so many pirate solar panels, solar windows, and battery arrays out there. We'll have a people-powered grid. Then Proda won't be able to control anything in this city ever again. Paprika rolled their eyes. PSSSH. Like that many of the people want in on this. The people put Proda in charge after 29, right? Zero looked at Paprika, screwing his face up. That's not exactly what happened. No, he said. He looked behind them, then back up at the antenna. But that's a story for another day. He turned back to the floating screens. Okay, Jason, light it up, he commanded. At the safe house, Riz and Jason made final adjustments to a tangle of wires. White noise crackled through the speakers. Jason flicked a switch. A radio signal buzzed to life, filling the dead air with a steady hum. You guys hear me? Jason asked. The words ricocheted out through the infrared link, hitting the antenna on Sutro Tower. They bounced from there out into the city. The voices skimmed across town, picked up by members of the resistance tuned in using the FM radio app from the NFT. Got you, answered Shiv, strong-arming another antenna into position on a rooftop downtown. Me 3. Loud and clear, answered Taki, walking down a busy street, tuning his radio app into 92.7 FM. We hear you, Koth chimed in from his kitchen with Michelle. Back on the hill, Zero smiled as voice after voice responded, yes. The sea of voices became thicker and louder as the network came online. He turned to Paprika and nodded with a big smile. The voices grew into one jumbled cacophony, chanting over and over. Yes. Art felt bad about breaking his promise to Michelle. But at least he didn't feel the pull to go deep quite as much as he had the day before. One day at a time, they kept telling him. His heart felt like it had been ripped out. He doubted that would change, no matter how many days he took at a time. Not after what he'd been through. He did feel rotten about being dishonest with her. Michelle had been so good to him, and she had no reason to. He'd promised her he wouldn't leave South City for a while, until he had at least 30 days clean, but he had to go back. He had to try. The streets in San Francisco were tense. Sirens whined in the distance. He stood on the corner under the shadow of a tree. He was a block away from his family's apartment on Kaepernick Avenue in the Richmond district, wearing a D-tag hoodie that Michelle had given him. He had no idea why Michelle had one of these. Best not to ask. Glowing "Do Not Cross" lines hovered in front of the entrance to his building. Marshals stood sentry. People had left flowers, candles, and all kinds of tributes on the sidewalk. The trees above rustled in the wind. Art turned and walked in the other direction, fighting back tears. He desperately wanted to go home. Where he should have been all along. He wanted to be in his son's room, to grieve for him there, where he belonged. He knew that was no longer possible. The sadness and shame were crushing. The tears rolled. He wiped his eyes, looking at the time. He had to meet Michelle before the VRA meeting. The trees behind him hissed as he headed back to the PRT. Art got out at South City and made his way back to the slum towers, trudging up the stairs towards Michelle's apartment. As he approached, he could hear talking, the babble of a newsfeed and the whir of a printer behind the door. He knocked. There was no answer. He knocked again. Still nothing. He tried the handle. The door creaked open, and the sounds got louder. Art looked around, blinking. There were weapons everywhere. Guns, armor. Was that a rocket launcher? "Aye!" shouted Koth. "Don't you knock?" Michelle walked towards the door, hands raised, trying to calm Koth. All right, Koth. "I got it," she said calmly, ushering Art out and stepping out onto the walkway, closing the door behind her. Art took a step back. He studied Michelle. "It's not what you think," Michelle said, nursing her swollen shoulder. "It's not," replied Art. "Art, I said I would help you with your recovery, but this here is my personal business." "It's personal all right," Art said, turning and looking out at South City from the walkway balcony. He looked back at Michelle. "Look, I'm on your side. More than you know," Michelle sighed, shaking her head. "I'm sure you are. I know there's a lot going on out there in the world right now, but you have one priority, Art. Get clean. That's it. Go to meetings. Work the steps. Do what I told you. Follow the rules. That's all. That's what you promised me you'd do." "I know, Michelle," Art nodded. "But it's not that simple." "It is that simple," Michelle snapped. Art looked at her, his face getting hot. Finally, he let it out. "You want to hear the part I'm not gonna share at the meetings, Michelle?" My son is." His voice cracked. "Carlos. The boy from the news, that was murdered in the Broadside game." "So yes, Michelle, it's pretty damn personal." Michelle stood frozen. "Carlos was my son," Art sobbed. He paused, lowering his head as the tears began to fall. He looked up, wiping his face and taking a breath. "My other child. Paprika is still out there. Paprika was with him, at least I think so. When it happened. They're missing. No one on the news has even mentioned them. I must find Paprika." Michelle blinked, taking this all in. Art wiped his nose. "I know I'm no use to anyone until I'm clean, but you must let me help you. Fighting back and helping this guy Warhead is the only way I can make amends to Carlos. It's my only shot at finding Paprika. So, I'm not asking you. I'm begging you. Let me help with whatever you're doing in there. Please?" The hexacopter's rotors chopped through the mist above Twin Peaks. It flickered in and out of visibility, hanging over the city, shrouded in the nighttime fog. Rook marched through the ship's hull. His limbs cut the air as he walked, his body taut from decades of military training. He made his way to the captain's bridge at back of the ship, agitated. The bridge teemed with engineers, technicians, and security personnel he'd flown in from HQ. 2 dog jets idled outside on a landing pad connected to the bridge. Marshals stood sentry at all doors. He looked out over the gloomy skies below. All he could see of the city were blotches of light refracting through the clouds. The sharp prongs of Sutro Tower were punctured the fog, red warning lights blinked up at Rook. Something was not right. Rook turned 180 degrees and looked back at his team. Their orders were clear: check, double-check, and triple-check every possible channel for signs of chatter. They hadn't heard anything meaningful for days. The usual online haunts of the various miscreants and terrorist sympathizers he kept eyes on were dead. Sure, there were riots and protests happening every night. More copyright crimes than they could ever deal with. It wasn't like they didn't have work to do, far from it. But that was just the foot soldiers. Where were the generals? Something felt off. Certain people who usually made a lot of noise were making none. It had all gone quiet. Too bloody quiet. Rook walked past a bench of engineers listening in on various channels. He stopped at a big guy hunched over his desk, staring at a signal oscillating in a green void. The engineer looked over his shoulder as Rook loomed. Rook reached past him and turned up the volume on his screen. A faint hum was coming through the hiss and crackle of radio static. "What's that?" Rook snapped. "Some weird interference," said the engineer with a shrug. "Started a couple of hours ago. There's no data in it. Just white noise. It's probably nothing. Keep an eye on it," Rook ordered. The engineer grimaced at the prospect of losing another night's sleep. Rook leaned over him, letting out a frustrated sigh. "Nothing is nothing," Rook said. The engineer looked mystified. "Nothing is always something," Rook continued, "and something is definitely up. Do you get what I'm saying to you?" The engineer nodded, like he didn't get it at all. He turned back to the screen, which was enough for Rook. He walked back to a window. A gap appeared in the fog. The city glimmered 10,000 feet below. The din of the hexacopter's huge blades grew louder behind him.